Given this tragic pattern, one could throw up his hands and think there's nothing to do. But we have to believe, for the sake of our children, there is a way through this. How do we think about it? To examine that question, we turn now to Daniel Webster, director of the Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Policy and Research. Catherine Newman, author of the book Rampage, The Social Roots of School Shootings, and a professor of sociology at the University of Massachusetts. Robert Draper, writer-at-large for the New York Times Magazine. He has studied the history of the NRA. And Christina Anderson. She was 19 years old when she was wounded in the Virginia Tech shooting, Rampage, in 2007, and has since founded an organization called the Koshka Foundation for Safe Schools. And we welcome all of you to the program. I think we all agree we don't accept the idea that we can just give up. We have to keep trying to solve this to make it less likely that these terrible shootings happen. I want to ask each one of you, starting with you, Catherine Newman, what is one way we should be thinking about this right now that could possibly move us forward?
I think we have to understand that these shootings are planned, often long in advance, and that the shooters usually leave a trail of threats or suggestions about what they're going to do. We need to make it easier for people who hear those threats to come forward to people who can make a difference, to the adults in their environment, to police in their environment. It was remarkable to me in the research I did how much information was actually available, so much so that in some instances kids did not come to school on the day when those shootings occurred, but no adult was ever informed. Understanding what retards kids from coming through with information and getting it to the right source is an important task, and I do think there's something we can do about that.
So if that is one way to think about this, Daniel Webster, what would you say?
Well, I would say that the United States is unique not with respect to troubled youth. It's unique with respect to our inability to address easy access to firearms. It can seem as though that's impossible in a country with so many firearms, but there are reasonable measures. You focus on appropriate standards for legal gun ownership, and I think what's particularly relevant in this case is, and in many other cases that lead to mass shootings, and that includes domestic violence, there are warning signs, as Dr. Newman suggested, and there are new legal tools, new laws called extreme risk protection orders that work very similar to the way a court does with domestic violence restraining orders, where evidence is examined and judges and law enforcement can act swiftly to protect individuals' lives when someone is amassing firearms and planning something very diabolical.
So taking preventive action in the moment, in effect. Christina Anderson, as someone who was a victim yourself, as we said, of the shooting at Virginia Tech, you spent a lot of time thinking about this. You work on it on a regular basis. What would you suggest we start to think about now?
I would add an echo to the feelings of the importance of prevention and look at how do we holistically embody the values of security and safety and culture throughout the entire community. So adding on to Catherine's point, how do we educate and prepare and train the staff of these institutions, from the janitors to the bus drivers to the teachers? We have the campaigns of see something, say something, but more proactivity and acceptance that it's okay to speak up and make sure they understand what their options are for reporting, what that process looks like, if there's a formal threat assessment team in place to monitor and kind of look at that individual of concern. And then long-term, looking at recovery and how do we take care of our communities, because in this case particularly, we're going to have the students that were injured, but also those that were in the building that heard the gunfire. You don't have to be physically injured to be impacted by this event.
No question about it. Robert Draper, you've spent a lot of time thinking about another aspect of all this that gets raised and then often gets shoved aside because people say it's not time to talk about it, but it's guns, it's availability. of guns. Daniel Webster just mentioned it. Why has it been so hard to do anything about the extraordinary access to guns?
It's actually can be summarized in one word: NRA. The National Rifle Association is the most powerful lobbying organization in America. It's powerful not just because of the money that it has and the membership that it has, but the quality of the membership, which is to say that they make their opinions heard, make their opinions count, more quantifiably, I think, than any other organization in America. Attested to by the fact that the last time we saw any major legislative effort mounted to control guns, any kind of gun safety law, was almost exactly 5 years ago this time, in the wake of the Newtown shooting. There have been numerous such shootings since then, and no political will whatsoever to seek a legislative remedy, and that is clearly because of the efforts by the NRA, who have made it clear to Republicans in particular that they will pay a heavy political price if they ever were to sign on to such legislation.
Daniel Webster, I heard you suggesting that there may be a way in here if you could be very specific about when you move on someone who may be thinking about doing something terrible.
Yes, and the restrictions with respect to firearms do not need to be lifelong. Sometimes these risks are really acute, it's been more acceptable, and we have research evidence to show in the case of restraining orders for domestic violence that remove firearms and have firearms restrictions, it leads to fewer homicides. We've demonstrated that actually in several studies. And so I think this policy is simply an extension of that same concept of recognizing at a point in time there's danger. Ready access to lethal weapons makes that something you have to act on.
But Catherine Newman, Catherine Newman, what you're telling us is that a lot of this is going to depend on others speaking up who have some reason to believe there's a reason to be really concerned about somebody.
That's exactly right, because we need the information in advance. And there are ways we can encourage that to happen. In high schools, where kids may feel they're going to pay a social price for being identified as teachers' pets or tattletales, having trusted adults like school resource officers in the area, in the cafeteria, people who get to know the kids, so that they can come forward to someone who doesn't appear to be connected to the school's disciplinary authority system. We found students in high school were very able to do that and felt more comfortable with that, and because they thought that those school resource officers would take this seriously, would investigate quietly, and would take action where it was warranted. Because we must remember, 9 times out of 10, the threats they hear will not mean anything. They will be idle. But the 1 time out of 10 when it really does matter, they need someone to come forward to that they feel comfortable doing so with.
Christina Anderson, how then do you get the word to these young people who are growing up? Every parent wants their child to believe that they're going to be safe. How do you get word to young people when it's time to speak up, when it's time to say something's wrong here, we need to, and to go to an adult?
Mm-hmm. I think you begin by having really candid conversations that can begin at the dinner table in your own home, to really the teacher in the classroom, and being willing to have sometimes uncomfortable and difficult discussions and meeting them in ways that they feel comfortable. So a lot of schools use anonymous tip lines, web-based tools, mobile applications. Some schools do paper surveys, and they just ask, who in the school do you think needs, is being bullied or needs some attention, and just, slide that under someone's desk. There are ways that someone can feel comfortable and empowered if they feel like their identity is going to be protected, if they don't have to come forward, initially. And to Catherine's point, if they feel like they're going to be heard and taken seriously and given feedback and response to whatever that threat may be. One thing we often say is the minute you have that gut feeling, to honor that and to speak up. And just with my experience with law enforcement, I've often heard they would rather respond to 1,000 red herrings that become absolutely nothing than one event like Virginia Tech. And so often it's building those partnerships, knowing that there's multiple people that one can go to before it's necessarily the local police officer, although an SRO is a wonderful candidate as well.
Robert Draper, I'm going to come back to you on the gun question because it is being raised already. Are the folks who've been advocating for gun control measures been going about it the right way? Is it the approach, do you think, that's been a problem? I mean, how do you look at it?
Well, let's be clear. It's not the main problem, but it is a problem. I mean, the real problem, frankly, resides with the Republicans, who have really shown nothing in the way of political will to address this problem, even when it happens, you know, in their own state. And we have in the White House a president who understands his political base all too well. It consists of evangelicals and gun owners, and he is loath to cross them. But it's true what you're saying, or what you're suggesting, Judy, that I think that proponents of gun safety legislation need to be careful and not fall into a trap that's arguably laid for them by the gun lobby by overstepping and proposing legislation that would not be a remedy for a particular instance. In this particular case, the alleged Florida shooter purchased an AR-15 legally. Closing universal background checks wouldn't have done anything to remediate that. So in the wake of this, if people are to propose legislation that really has nothing to do with a particular crisis at hand, it will lead gun groups to say, see, they are obviously just using this as an excuse to take away your Second Amendment rights.
Right, which is the argument we hear. And Daniel Webster, you know, we go back to what happened in Las Vegas, bump stocks. This was this device we learned about which could increase the capacity of a gun, and yet nothing was done there.
Well, it is very frustrating, and I think it's exactly for the reasons just expressed of why we've been spinning our wheels. I think there is some action at the some state levels, and I do think that part of this is putting together something that makes sense and has evidence behind it. And I think in the case, one thing that's not being discussed in this particular case is you have a 19-year-old, or actually I believe he purchased the AR-15 as an 18-year-old. We don't allow 20-year-olds to buy a beer, but we allow 18-year-olds to buy as many semi-automatic weapons and as much ammo as they would like. I think something's wrong with this picture, and I think that should be part of the discussion.
Okay, in the little bit of time we have left, I'm going to go around and ask each one of you, I mean, just so that we can begin to think in a way that could possibly be productive here. What is one thing that you think could be done in the short term to begin to address this? And I'm going to come back to you, Catherine Newman.
I would enable more school resource officers, often, sadly, the first thing to be cut in a budget slush. I would enable those school resource officers to remain on the job, because they are the people that young folks will feel comfortable turning to deliver the information we need to prevent these shootings.
Christina Anderson.
I would ask that schools, school boards, school principals take the time to create written all hazards emergency response plans for all types of threats, whether it's with a firearm, a truck, a knife, whatever that may be, and make sure that they are practiced diligently and with local law enforcement throughout the entire year.
And Daniel Webster.
Well, I would say extreme risk protection orders to address, to allow court action to remove firearms when someone clearly has a lot of signals that they are planning something very dangerous. And that is a type of policy that extends well beyond the schools, because if this young man didn't shoot up a school, what else would he have shot up? So the issue really is you have somebody with really malintent, and you're allowing them to amass firearms.
And finally, Robert Draper.
Sure, unless politicians are persuaded that there is a cost to be paid by not supporting gun safety legislation, they won't do anything. Therefore, I think it's going to require outside groups, frankly, shaming politicians, particularly those communities that have been affected by such tragedies. The Newtown parents got involved. It's the closest we have seen to legislative remedies, and I would expect that that's probably going to be the best way for politicians to understand the emotional power of such legislative remedies.
And I heard a mother in Florida today looking at a camera and saying to Washington, you've got to stop these guns from getting into the hands of these children. Well, thank you all, four of you, Robert Draper, Daniel Webster, Catherine Newman, and Christina Anderson. Thank you.